Welcome to Adventures in Accessibility, a podcast that explores the far reaches of disability, access, and inclusion.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us. On today's episode, we speak with Sanchez, who grew up in the Los Angeles area and spent 6 years as a member of the United States Marine Corps. He became a part of the Special Forces unit, deploying twice to the Middle East. In 2001, while in the process of transferring to the Navy to become a Navy SEAL, Sanchez was involved in a motorcycle accident that injured his spinal cord. He started handcycling competitively 5 years after the incident. Today, he is one of the top handcyclists in the world. Well, hi, Oz. Thank you so much for being our guest today on Adventures in Accessibility.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, well, some of our listeners might not be familiar with you or your work, so I want to get into that. But first, can you tell us about yourself, specifically the story of your life, growing up, and ultimately how you acquired your disability?
Sure. Essentially, I grew up in the Los Angeles County area. I'm, first generation, offspring to migrants from Mexico. And as with typical migrants, my parents were low socioeconomic status, had the vision of the American dream to provide a better platform and environment for their to raise a family. But nonetheless, struggled and had some pitfalls. I would say that aren't uncommon to any other immigrant family in that same situation. So growing up, I remember really having a lot of a sense of sort of misdirection, frustration, a lack of sense of belongingness, not really feeling like I fit in anywhere. And really, really, really low self-esteem. That's probably the thing that stood out the most. Emotionally speaking, I felt very vulnerable and fragile. Mostly because of probably the experience I had with growing up with my mother, who had her own traumas as childhood and was dealing with long-term depression, and then just the environment of living in in a school system that's overpopulated, understaffed, and sort of being just a product of that environment. And that was very much sort of what I lived by. I would say that what kept me pretty straight and narrow for the most part was my affinity for athleticism and physical fitness. I think as any child experiencing hardship and trauma, they lean into something that allows them to cope or at least maintain some sort of equilibrium and balance. And for me, that ended up being working out and fitness, particularly mountain biking. I remember as young as being 11 years old, I would do 100 push-ups and 100 sit-ups and maybe 300 ab crunches in my top bunk bed before going to sleep pretty much nightly. I don't know how normal, this is for an 11-year-old boy. But that seemed pretty excessive, and it worked out pretty well. But, again, it's all about balance. And in my version of, my little corner of the world, that was giving me the balance. So where I felt inadequate in most areas of life, I was able to sort of compensate for that by being fit. And riding my bike faster than my peers, or doing more push-ups, pull-ups, the monkey bars, the playground, kickball, dodgeball, whatever. That's where we excelled. And this is pretty normal from my understanding. I think where the problems really started was once I got out of high school. I didn't have any plans when I exited high school. I had a clearer idea of what I didn't want to do out of fear rather than what I did want to do. And that was essentially, I didn't want to go to college because I had barely stumbled out of high school and completed high school. Matter of fact, I didn't complete high school. I ended up getting a GED. And then I also, because my brother, 2 years my senior, had joined the Army pretty much right out of high school. I always felt he was adopted because he had a plan for life. He seemed very structured, deliberate, intentional, good grades. Mama loved him. Never really had any affiliations with drugs or gangbanging or anything like that. He just seemed to be to me, the ideal model older brother and student. And I don't know, it just seemed like life came easy to him. So I always just assumed he was adopted. No joke. I confirmed that he's not adopted, but At the time, I felt like he was. And so because we had no prior military history in our family prior to my brother joining, he did set a precedent that was an option and an alternative for me. But again, my low self-esteem, I completed high school with a 1.9 GPA or something like that. So that was also another thing that I was certain I wasn't going to do. And then the third option that was that I didn't want to settle down and, get married and have kids. But again, sports were no longer accessible. I wasn't in post high school academia, so I didn't have access to sports in junior college or college. So as with most teens that have too much time on their hand that live in the big city area, I started getting sort of meddled in with the wrong crowd. Certain events led to rather undesirable situations with the law and getting arrests and multiple arrests. And eventually that was enough pressure for me to decide to join the Marine Corps, because I realized that was going to set me on a path. And it was only a matter of time before I did something or was involved in something that could potentially affect my life for the rest of my life, like, prison or crime or whatever. And it just kind of snowballs effect. And I had a twin sister who we were experiencing this sort of mischief simultaneously. And she was definitely seems to be getting pulled into that crowd further and faster than me. So that was kind of a cue that I needed to find a different option and a different plan. So the fear of what could be and how that might affect my life there was greater than the fear of failing in the military. So therefore, I signed up and decided to join the Marine Corps when I was 19.
So you went through the Marine Corps, and I read that you were just getting ready to join the Navy, right? The Navy SEALs, when you acquired your disability. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the brief sort of recap of my time in service in the Marine Corps was that I found myself very much comfortable and at home. Boot camp was an easy time for me. And I don't say that lightly. It just happens to be that I was so fit because I again, balanced and sort of did self-therapy, or my outlet was through working out. So by the time I got to being in the Marine Corps, I was used to all of their, training protocols of endless amounts of push-ups, sit-ups, running, obstacle courses. So none of that was really new to me. And then the other element really was, the drill instructors getting in your face and yelling at you. That was really nothing that I hadn't already been exposed to from my mother. The difference was my mother both threatened and had the ability to actually inflict bodily harm, whereas the drill instructors didn't. So boot camp wasn't really too big of an issue for me. Where the issue really started was once I got into Fleet Marine Corps after boot camp, specifically with the infantry, because I joined infantry, was that I had this big chip on my shoulder, basically sort of this mindset of the street rules, that essentially if I don't feel like you can kick my behind, then I don't have to listen to you or respect you. And that seemingly was just never going to work as long as I, decided to, try to be successful in an outfit like the Marine Corps, where structure, rank, and authority is paramount. But, with the Marine Corps, they're very deliberate and methodical, their approach to most anything. And they had a very methodical approach to sort of even out that chip on my shoulder through a few lashings and beatdowns and hazing sessions. And so basically once I experienced this attitude adjustment, I found myself, learning that if I didn't adopt the rules and play by the rules and the paradigms of the Marine Corps, that I was essentially going to get kicked out. And that was almost inevitable because of just the amount of problems that I created for myself with this attitude problem. But once I made the switch and said, well, let me see if I can succeed by playing by their rules. And that very much was the case. I set a couple of unit and command records for promotions into corporal and sergeant in the short 6-year period that I was in the Marine Corps. I deployed twice. And so by the time I got back after my second deployment from the Middle East, I had felt like as much as I love the Marine Corps, and by this point I was in Special Operations Command, Marine Reconnaissance or Recon Marine, that I wanted to try something different and bigger. And so my brother had already actually made his way into Army Special Forces, and he was a Green Beret. And so now we were kind of equals, and we'd always had this tit for tat kind of relationship because, I was his punk little brother and I had something to prove to him. So I remember that once he caught up to me, because I made special operations first, even though he had been in the Army prior to my joining the Marine Corps. He made it up to Army Special Forces. And so then I said, well, I got to one up him. And my version of that was I'll go over to the SEAL teams. Join the Navy, go through the SEAL team pipeline, and then eventually try to work my way up to SEAL Team 6, which is a pretty ambitious goal, even in present day. And he retorts that, I'll make it up to Delta Force. And, so it was just kind of like this tit for tat kind of scenario. So I decided to get out of the Marine Corps and actually sign up for the Navy. And I had about a 2-month waiting period before I was scheduled to class up for the Navy basic SEAL training. And during this period, I was just riding my motorcycle a lot because I was essentially on vacation. And it was on one of these rides that I basically was caught between my speeding and negligence, and another vehicle ran a stop sign. And that combination ended up causing an accident where I broke my back and caused some spinal cord injury. And obviously that ended my military career and that option.
I was reading on your website that you mentioned going through sort of a post-injury depression and having sort of an identity crisis around being a person with an acquired disability. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that and what that was like for you, and the steps that it took you to get through that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Without knowing it, all of us engage in identity forming and creation. And we, whether consciously or subconsciously, associate much of our identity to what we essentially dedicate our lives to doing, whether that be our job or our roles as parents or teachers or whatnot, you name it. We unintentionally or unwittingly do this. And the issue, and most of the time, we can go our entire lives without really having any issue around this process that's happening behind the scenes. But where it becomes a real possible critical situation is when you create an identity, a longstanding identity that you really have a love and close relationship with, and then life somehow changes the scenario, so you no longer have access to that identity. So for me, because I had always felt seemingly worthless, subpar, really low self-esteem, and incapable of manifesting or achieving much in my life. When I achieved special operations, 6 years in the Marine Corps, and now I was doing something as ambitious as pursuing SEAL Team 6, or even just the idea that you're in the special operations community, which is already a step above. So you're pulling the elite from within the elite, right? This gave me a strong sense of confidence that, sure, I might not be the sharpest guy in the room or much for brains, but I compensate that with brawn. And that's what got me to this point in my career and in my life. And I had created something that I was proud of. And so now when I broke my back and had permanent and irreversible paralysis as a result of this essentially negligence on my part, I was still in love with the identity of military special operations in the Marine Corps. And I no longer had access to this identity. So now you have an identity crisis. And so the notions of identity shifting or migration or, being plastic and malleable in these ideas isn't taught, isn't spoken to. You don't go to school. High school doesn't teach this. Even college doesn't teach this really, unless you specifically go find these types of classes of behavioral psychology and whatnot. So I learned this process through trial and error on my own. But before I learned that process, I basically went through the better part of a solid decade of deep, dark hopelessness and depression, to the point where suicidal ideation was a daily norm. And, I did on a couple of occasions try to take my life. The body is resilient. My will to live, and because of how I was raised by my mother, is really stubborn. And so by, that grace, I was able to still maintain, clinging on to life until the point where I started seeing things a little bit differently. And then that's when I started migrating over to having some sense of hope, that I could turn it all around and figure something out in a different capacity. And that mostly came through the power and the rehabilitative power of sports specifically, without my knowing it. It was happening in the background.
Wow. Well, I'm so glad you came through that dark time. How old were you when you had your accident?
I was 25. Yeah. So that was, that'll be 20 years ago this July that the accident took place.
And after that happened, were you given any resources? Did anybody help you navigate your new reality, or was that something you just had to figure out on your own?
Well, the key point or distinction there is that it wasn't something I had to figure out on my own, but because of my sort of Mexican egoism heritage, machismo, and then on top of that, compounded by Marine Corps infantry, then further compounded by Marine Corps special operations of the Spartan warrior that can do it all. I didn't seek any help. Matter of fact, I frowned upon and refused any help, to the point where I essentially cut ties with most of my friends and for the most part, blocked my family out. And as a matter of fact, I was engaged to be wed when I had my accident. And we, in spite of my trying to talk my fiance out of postponing the wedding until, I figured out whether I'd ever walk again or not, she decided otherwise and said that, you're still you, I still love you. We're still doing this. So we got married in the ICU room right before I went into surgery. And because I said, in my mind anyways, I had already pushed those wedding vows, in sickness and in health already beyond any kind of level of comprehension or expectation. I didn't feel it was fair to her that she had to sort of get stuck with a half man, because in my mind, I was broken now. So I even forced her out of my life and emotionally sort of cut her off to the point where, there was nothing to hang on to. And so we separated. In the moment we separated, living together anyways, I filed for a divorce because as far as I was concerned, I was a sinking ship and I wasn't bringing anybody down with me. And so I didn't have to go it alone, but I did go it alone. And I did this to myself in large part.
Do you still feel that way about yourself, or has your perspective changed?
Yeah. So that broken person thing was just a perception. So one of the things that I've learned to master is all of these notions and ideas around perception and framing, and the stories and narratives that we perpetuate and purport to others and to ourselves, both in private when we're thinking to ourselves or how we speak about ourselves to others. All of these are plastic and they're self-constructive. And at any point, we can choose to share a different story of ourselves and our reality. If we truly continue to share the same story over and over, we'll start to believe whatever that new narrative is. So whether it's true or not doesn't really matter. As long as you're saying it and you believe it, then that becomes your reality. So what I came to realize now, so to answer your question, is no, I don't feel like I'm broken anymore. My body might be broken, and even that is a point of debate, but I'm not broken, right? Somebody who can lose their ability to speak, hear, see, inside their consciousness and in their mind, they're still the same individual, right? They just don't have access to certain ways of existing and engaging with other human beings because of that limitation. But they, the individual, the consciousness that is Oz or, whoever we're speaking to is still the same entity. So I had to learn to basically make these distinctions and disassociate my personal identity, back to identity again, from my body, because my body arguably may or may not be broken. I like to use the word different, not disability or not, limitations, because I am just as active, if not more active. I am just as capable, if not more capable, than I was prior to my injury. It's just a simple matter that I do things differently, right? Because if we're talking about it, the disability part, well, I seriously doubt that the able-bodied version of me could ride a hand bike the way I ride a hand bike right now with a different version of me, right? So it isn't so much a disability, more so that we just have to do things differently and find different ways to have and do those things that make us feel fulfilled in life.
And that's a great segue into my next question, which is, how did you get introduced into the world of adaptive sports? When did you know that you had what it takes to be a world champion? And then second part of the question is, we would love for you to share with our audience your proudest athletic accomplishments as you see them.
I think I was initially exposed to a hand bike at the VA during one of my PT physical therapy sessions shortly after my injury. I had about a 2-year period where the doctor basically said, you cannot consider working out. Don't even look at our weight. Your back is so unstable. You did such a catastrophic break. And he had me in his Kydex jacket, which is basically like a turtle shell, and I couldn't move much. And so for the better part of 2 years, I was mostly just doing PT and OT, physical therapy and occupational therapy. And one of my sessions at I believe the VA in La Jolla was the first time I remember seeing a bike, but I didn't really ask anything about it. And then some time later, might have been that same year, an outfit here in San Diego called the Challenge Athletes Foundation, which is a nonprofit that basically fundraises and provides adaptive equipment for disabled individuals, has an annual San Diego Triathlon Challenge. And I believe at that event is where I was exposed to the athletes on the bike doing their thing. I didn't participate, but I was just there kind of as a spectator. And I remember seeing the bikes and I was like, hey, I want one of those. And that was, I believe, in it was the following year after my injury in 2002. And then I recall in 2003 sometime, I got my first hand bike. And I don't think I've been off of it since.
Tell us about all your athletic accomplishments and especially the ones you're most proud of.
Well, let's see. At present day, I think I have 7 world championship titles. 5 of them specialize in the time trial race. And that's kind of the thing that I lean into just because of my size and style of racing. I don't do so well on the road race just because my size. There's also a team relay event, which Team USA has done pretty well over the years, but most of them are in the time trial specifically. I've also done a number of probably close to a dozen half Ironman events. I remember in 2008 or 9, I think 2009, I said I wanted to do Kona Ironman. And so I started working myself up to making both the fitness standard and then qualifying for Kona. And in 2010, I did go to Kona Ironman and competed. And I had a finish time of 12 hours and 30 minutes, which was to me disappointing. But I know just in general lay population, that's still pretty respectable finish time. And then I kind of switched focus back to hand biking specifically. And on the Paralympic venue, I've been to 3 Paralympic games. My first one was in Beijing, 2008. I won both a gold and a bronze there. Then I went to London, won a gold and a bronze again. And then most recently, Rio, I won a silver and a bronze. So I have a total of 6 Paralympic medals. And then I guess, probably pretty common for most athletes. I guess anybody who's been to an Olympic or Paralympic level venue would be winning your first medal at your first Paralympic or Olympic Games. And for me, that was my first medal was in Beijing, and it was a gold medal in the time trial. It was a rather unique situation because, as with anybody who's ever sat in front of the TV and watched the buildup and the story plots of a bunch of the different athletes leading up to the Olympic Games, it's all about this story because that kind of draws you into what that individual might be experiencing. And for me, what ended up being really weird when I won my first gold medal is I couldn't celebrate it because the story of my teammate and mentor, who was essentially the previous version of me before I took over the torch and started dominating, he was the dominant one. He was the multiple world champion, and he had been to Athens and won the silver, and he was the favored one to win the gold in the time trial event, which I inevitably beat him to, and then he ended up in second place. But the story and the backdrop with him was that he was struggling with, had some personal struggles. And then his wife, for some reason, opted to wait until the games to serve him a divorce. And so when he lost, and then to me, I felt really guilty, even though I didn't cause the situation, but because he was such a friend of mine and mentor and taught me so much in the sport, that I became that villain that essentially defied or denied him what would have been his retirement plan right there, because he was planning on retiring after those games. He did retire anyways, but we all want to end on a high note. And so in the end, I was very, very much subdued with my celebration. And even at the podium, people were like, dude, like, are you even like glad that you won? Like you look like you're the first, loser off the podium, the way your facial expression, because I was very much suppressed because of what was going on with him. But inevitably that night in my room about 2 or 3 in the morning, I celebrated in private, because I remember just waking up and, going to the bathroom and coming back and then turning the light on and looking at the gold medal and just like screaming like, and just like, I want a gold medal. It was completely by myself at 2, 3 in the morning. And I did have a roommate who woke up and he's like, what the heck's going on? What are you doing? And I was just like, I want a gold medal. And he totally knew what was going on. And he was like, you're crazy. And he just rolled over and went back to sleep. But like, that was my version of having, celebrating my first gold medal. It was, but to this day, I mean, it's still probably the most memorable, accomplishment that I've had with regards to sport, in the sport since being in it.
And have you ever had the chance to visit the Olympic and Paralympic Museum here in Colorado Springs?
Yeah. I have been there a number of times for a period. We had 2 camps there yearly. And so I'm very familiar with the Colorado Springs Training Center. I've never been a resident athlete there, but during those training camps, we'd stay there for a month or so at a time. So I'm pretty familiar. It's so I haven't been there, at least at the museum, probably in about 8 years now. So it's been some time.
Yeah, well, they just opened a new museum within the last year or 2. It's really a stunning example of universal design. It's super accessible, so I wondered if you had been there. Yeah, you should check it out. Well, I want to turn a little bit now to kind of talking more about the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act specifically. I wonder when and how did you learn about the ADA, and how do you feel it impacts your life, if at all?
Are we speaking about the ADA with regards to legislation, federal legislation, as far as how we implement accessibility options and accommodations for people with disabilities in the U.S.?
Yep. Yeah.
Disappointingly, I guess, maybe with regards to your question, I don't really keep up with policy legislation. I rarely watch the news. I don't watch much TV at all. I'm not up on the latest pop culture. And so it's kind of off my radar. I've been to Mexico. I've been all over Europe since my injury. And all I experience is some places are more easy to get around in, and some places are really difficult to get around in. But I never really see the lack of inclusion or discrimination component. And that's a choice because, whether I'm being discriminated against or not, I simply don't choose to experience that or perceive it. I simply might interpret it as like, well, that's a rather unpleasant person that just went by, and so, I think obviously if you're asking me what my thoughts around the value and the need and necessity of having the things like the ADA in place, I'm obviously, maybe not obviously, but I'm a strong proponent that things like that are necessary. And just because I don't necessarily keep up with policy and legislation doesn't mean that I'm not a benefactor of it. And I would argue that the U.S., comparable to many other countries, is way ahead of the curve as far as having things in place that force inclusivity and accessibility to many people that wouldn't have the means to get in and out of certain facilities otherwise. And so with that regard, I'm not ignorant and so naive to think that it doesn't make any sense to have it. I don't know why they do it. We're wasting our time. That would be totally counterintuitive to my belief. So I think it's a need. I think it's a must. I have been to 3 Paralympic games. This will be my 4th one, shy of an injury. If all goes as planned, I'll be in Tokyo. And for whatever reason, we haven't had a Paralympic presence on a media national kind of level televised event. Right. And so even though we've done much in the concept of inclusivity with the ADA and all that legislation and everything at the federal level, we still have work to go. And I believe that once the U.S. Mass, public at large gets exposed and a taste of, the Paralympic venues in Tokyo, because my understanding is that they will be televised a little bit more than in the past. I think that will make like exponential difference in leaps and bounds about inclusivity and further pushing that movement of sort of breaking down, racial and physical divides that seemingly tear our society apart presently.
Mm-hmm. So if you were going to say your hope for the future of accessibility, would you say that it would be that increased representation and media coverage of people with all kinds of differences and different abilities?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you said it pretty much verbatim and better than I would have said it. But essentially, all racial divides or discrimination is nothing more than ignorance, and not ignorance with that negative connotation, because ignorance by definition is simply lack of knowledge or not knowing. And when we get exposed and familiar with things, we no longer see them as they and or others, right? We just see them as, one human race and just different, right? How many of us have thought about like, well, that person's hair color is different than mine, and I'm not sure if I can trust them. Nobody thinks like that anymore. And eventually through this, further progression of, televising something like the Paralympic Games or having something like the ADA in place, people will eventually stop seeing things different things as they and others, right? And problematic, and they'll become familiar with it, and then it'll just be different, and that's it. And we'll think about it as casual as hair color. That may not happen tomorrow. That probably won't happen after the Tokyo Games, but we need to move in that direction, particularly with this current state of affairs with our society. And hopefully that starts happening sooner than later.
So, Oz, it seems like you're a really positive person, and your goal is kind of to inspire people. So I would love to know, what would you say to listeners who are feeling defeated right now, either because of a personal struggle or because of current events?
Yeah, I would say, first of all, there's a big distinction between jumping into, the current state of affairs of sort of public representation to change policy. For example, like with police brutality and what's happening right now on the media, and there is a need for that. There is a platform that must be addressed. And I'm all about it. But if we don't understand the distinction between going up against a system and systemic issues versus what you could lose an entire decade and a lifetime trying to change a systemic problem, right? I think Nelson Mandela was a good example of that, right? But Nelson Mandela had the character and the wherewithal and the energy to push back against a system, and that was his plan, and he did it very eloquently, right? But most of us don't have that kind of energy nor mental intestinal fortitude to do something like that. So if we just look at what we can do within our own little sort of pocket in our own part of the world, and influence that, we have energy to change something like getting off the sofa and stop feeling sorry for ourselves. Even just a simple workout of 30 minutes will change our neurochemical, psyche with oxytocin, dopamines, and all those feel-good chemicals. And that's the the antidepressant, that's Mother Nature's natural antidepressant. Lose a few pounds would change our attitude and our personal self-esteem. We start getting out more often. There's just so many little low-hanging fruits that we can do on an individual level. And the real only thing, an obstacle stopping us from doing that is some sort of limiting thought. And I came to realize this about myself. And so that's where my personal model came from, No Limits, because it's specifically speaking to my own limiting thoughts that I lived with for 10 years that almost got me to the point of death, right? And now, where I'm at now is the complete opposite side of that spectrum, right? I literally took, and I forget what book I read this from, but they said if you could take the worst thing that ever happened to you and somehow turn it into the best thing that ever happened to you, you got life pretty well figured out from that point forward. And I literally did that because for many years, the wheelchair was my prison and I was a victim of it. And now to this day, it is the best thing that ever happened to me because it forced and it demanded this emotional and spiritual growth and evolvement to the point where now, because of who I am spiritually, emotionally, and psychologically, I wouldn't want to go back to my old version of me because I don't believe I would have attained this level of growth and development, psychologically speaking, had I not had that fire to force and demand that level of commitment and resolve from me. And so as a result of that, I truly feel it is the best thing that ever happened to me because what it forced me to become. And so in the same sense, anybody can do this. This is accessible to anybody. That's not some woo-woo fairy dust ethereal thing. It's just an attitude of mine because at the end of the day, the only thing I ever had to get over was, my mindset, myself.
Wow, I love that. Well, where can our listeners go to learn more about you, book you for a speaking engagement, or watch the documentary you were recently featured in called Unbeaten?
Yeah, the documentary for a while was on Netflix. I don't believe it is anymore. I think it's still accessible on Amazon Prime. I haven't checked on it lately. As far as speaking engagements and whatnot, I have a website which is arguably not up to date. That's on my to-do list as many other things, but that's called nolimits.com. I'm probably most active on Instagram and Facebook. KNL Nation is my Instagram handle, or Oz Sanchez on Facebook. But as far as learning a bit about me, I guess there's a number of videos on YouTube from interviews I've done past, or Googling my name. That tends to work pretty well as well because I have a pretty good bio up on the Team USA website since I've been a longstanding athlete with the team.
Great. Well, is there anything else we should have asked you or that you would like to say before we wrap up today?
You didn't ask me about a fun fact.
Give me a fun fact.
Fun fact. So I'm an avid learner and consummate absorber of just new material. And I believe in the concept of meta skills. And meta skill is essentially a one singular thing, skill, or quality you can learn to master that will change many different elements of life. And for me, that was an easy one. It was learning how to read. And in this case, I didn't learn how to read by sitting and reading book, but I actually taught myself how to absorb books on Audible platform because I just, it was either sit still and read books endlessly, which is fine. Many people do that. But since I was working out so much and traveling so much, I figured if I learn how to do this audibly, I can read books while I'm doing many things in life simultaneously. So I forced myself to learn how to listen to books to the point where I can listen to any book on a single pass at 2.5 times regular speed. And if it's got a good narrator voice, I can even listen to it a second time at 3.5 speed. So imagine a 10-hour book that is now accessible to you in 3 hours, right? How many books can you blow through, having this capacity, this skill? And I remember I was inspired by both a book that I read by Tony Robbins and then the documentary on Netflix on Bill Gates' mind, Inside Bill's Mind or something like that, where they both read 3 books a week, like regularly. And I think Bill Gates still does read 3 books a week. And so that set my benchmark. And the best I got was for pretty much a whole year, I read about 2.5 books a week. So I blew through over 100 books that year. And since then, and this all started back in 2017 when I started graduate school, I've read probably about 150 different books, most of which 2 or more times. And so that by far has changed like everything about my consciousness in ways I couldn't even fathom or explain. But I guess that's my proudest fun fact that is completely separate and independent from like what my, publicly people know me as an athlete and whatnot.
That's great. What's one of your favorite books?
Ooh, I'll probably have to say Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. It's a very philosophical book around the notion of meaning and meaning making.
Awesome. Well, we will encourage our listeners to pick that up, and we thank you so much for being with us today.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Adventures in Accessibility. Tune in next time for another dive into the unknown.
Adventures in Accessibility is hosted and produced by Emily Schumann, and our sound engineer is Jessica Lucania. This podcast is a project of the Rocky Mountain ADA Center and is funded under a grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. Grant number 90DP0094-01-00. This production is intended solely for entertainment and informal guidance and should not be considered legal advice. The opinions expressed by guests are not necessarily held or endorsed by the Rocky Mountain ADA Center.